for the people of the
For
film.
emphasis, yeah.
That's fine. But, you know, the idea is to just be looking off-side.
Okay, great.
Okay, so...
Tell us when you're ready.
Okay, so we're ready. So,
Okay.
and just to introduce you, we always start off with asking your name, so you can state your name and what you do and what studies or anything you're into.
Okay.
To start.
Cool.
So it says, tell a bit about your work and how to okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
the
that
first
one,
thing,
yeah.
even before the questions, is to state your name.
Yeah. My name is Loree Erickson, and I do work sort of like pulling together lots of different fields like activism, art, and academia. I like to call myself a porn star academic and an activist community organizer. And I do work around sort of disability and sexuality in a broad sense, but more specifically, I'm sort of looking at the ways that, like in my academic world, I look at the ways that porn, queer crip porn specifically, so porn made by and for other queer crip or queer disabled folks, and how that can sort of work to transform cultures of undesirability. So just sort of thinking through the ways that the world is organized to create undesirable and desirable others, and how often marginalized people are put into the undesirable category. And so my work, a lot of it, the art, the activism, and the academic stuff is all about sort of how do we transform those experiences of marginality.
That sounds wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Catherine, you can start. And like I said, if the question isn't really related, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Okay. Tell us a bit about your work and how it addresses queer liberation.
So yeah, so my work is creating hot and sexy representations of queer disabled folks, and a lot of that work is about sort of connected to thinking about like putting out into the world, or not putting out into the world, but like working through possibility, and trying to expand what's like the current dominant imaginings in the world. So the ways that like dominant culture imagines what queerness is, and imagines what disability is, and imagines what like, you know, certain classed people are, and imagines just like all the different social categories that we inhabit and experiences that we have, and how those shape our lives. And so a lot of my work is about trying to expand the imaginings and pleasures and ways of being and living in the world, and doing that in a way that for me is distinctly sort of like a queer crip perspective on that, and that sort of just is drawing on the histories of queer and disabled liberation struggles, and movements, to, and like when I say new imaginings, you know, these are imaginings that have been always a part of us, always with us, but they haven't actually necessarily been shared as readily as other ways of imagining. So the way that I sort of see my work fitting into queer liberation is just around expanding what's possible and what's imaginable and what's like desirable, and ideas of what family and what care and what like bodies, how we think of bodies is also like a really big part of the work that I do. Yeah, and pleasure, all of those things. Yeah.
Yes, very good. You've partly answered this question when it comes to, can you share us with us experiences, activist, academia, artistic, you've had that you think is significant for us,
Mhm.
for how we think about queer liberation as theory or practice?
Well, I mean, that's sort of what that makes me think of is sort of how I got involved in making porn. And I mean, like, I was always, like, I haven't always lived in Toronto. I used to live in Virginia. That's where I was, like, I grew up in the country, and then I moved to Richmond, Virginia, which was like a city, like a bigger city in Virginia. It's like the capital. And, the reason why I went to Richmond from where I grew up, which is like it's Virginia, was because I was so desperate for just different kinds of community because I was queer. I realized I was queer like in high school, and I had like a few other like friends, but um, it just seemed like I wanted to like connect with like weird people, like just all kinds of different people, and you can't really do that living in like it's the same way that you can living in a city. And like I went to BCU, which is like Virginia Commonwealth University, and at the time that I went there, it was like known as being like anybody who was all different um, from like the dominant ideologies or whatever went to BCU because it's just like where you went if you lived in Virginia. Um, so I went there, and when I got to Richmond, the two reasons why I picked BCU um, outside of just because it's where you went if you were all different or artsy or lefty or whatever, was because they had a queer student group and an animal rights group. And I was like, well, I'm sold. That's all I need to be happy in university is to have sort of activist community because I couldn't access that the same way living in the country at the time. Not that you can't access activist community or like social justice community within rural settings, but I just didn't have access to that stuff. So I got involved in like social justice movements as soon as I got to university and got to a city and found myself a really amazing queer community. And like, you know, it started out as friends, like really just sort of like meeting a few people that we connected on a lot of different levels and really sort of like figured out all the stuff together and like figured out like, so what is queer versus lesbian and gay? What is this? What is that? You know, and like queerness was still like in our world relatively new at that time. I guess this was like in 1995 or something like that, 96. So it was like not as like now it's like fairly more readily people have more access to that term, I guess, and the ways that we take it up in activist scenes now, I think. And we also started like figuring out like what disability justice might look like as well. Like me and my best friend who wasn't disabled, but we just sort of would have these amazing conversations about all this stuff together. And that I feel like those moments and like having like these really tight friendship circles that then moved into activist and organizing circles because we would like work together and like hang out together and go to classes together and like just did everything together, really sort of like shaped I think a lot about how I think about organizing to this day is very much connected to like relationship building too, and how I think that that's like a really under articulated sort of phenomenon about the important role of like actually caring about each other and like getting to know each other and like how that also connects to yeah, like I'm just being at this point in my life now that I've moved to Toronto, I've gotten involved with other sort of queer communities, and sort of I'm reminded of that sort of like initial sort of beginning point of like how through caring about each other and just questioning and talking about things, we really started sort of unpacking a lot of stuff together and how important relationship building is when I got involved with transformative justice work. And that's transformative justice work is all about like transforming sort of the cultures of the world that sort of enable violence and create violence as like sort of expected, as opposed to like trying to imagine otherwise, and create a world where we like are good to each other and don't lock each other up. And so a friend of mine who is a femme gimp family member, she reminds me often about how relationship building is like such a key part to organizing and activism, and I think that the ways that like connects to the work I do outside of like making porn. I also have a collective of people who do my care stuff. So I'm somebody who needs like personal care. So I've been doing my care collectively for about 15 years now, I think, since I lived in Richmond. So people come help me get out of bed, go to the bathroom, do my laundry, get food, just do all those kinds of things. And that sort of started out with my friends doing some of my care stuff because I wasn't getting enough care provided, like paid for by the government. And then also after I finished university, all throughout university I spent the entire time arguing with my caseworker that like going to school, getting out of bed was like a school-related activity because the government only wanted to pay for care if it was school-related activity. And I was like, well, I have to get out of bed to go to school, so therefore getting out of bed is a school-related activity. Mm-hmm. And for some reason it took me 2 years of arguing with this caseworker to convince her of that. But as soon as I finished university, she was like, that's it, you're cut off. And so she shifted me over to this other program, which is kind of similar to like the direct funding program, where you can like hire your attendants and the government gives you like a certain amount of money to like pay for care. And they wanted, at that point in time, which was in like 1999, 2000, they wanted to give me $6 an hour to pay somebody, and the maximum amount of hours that you could get for a week were 42 hours a week, so that turned into 6 hours a day. And so it was $36 a day that I could pay somebody to like help me like get out of bed, go to the bathroom several times a day, eat food, and do all those things that are kind of necessary. And I couldn't find anybody that could afford to live off $36 a day, so my friends started supplementing my care stuff, and then we just decided to like institute it into like a more like organized manner. Also when I would have attendants who worked through agencies and that sort of thing, you don't have any say over who comes into your space and what kind of sort of ways, like who they are in the world and what they think about the world and about people in the world. And I dealt with a lot of really homophobic attendants and transphobic attendants, and so that was also another part of why we were like, well, why don't we just do it, right? Like, and it really, for me, like that solution really came out of like being part of like a social justice community. I was like, I have this problem, we already have this like idea of like being critical of like state structures and state solutions, right? And so we were like, if you don't like the state institutions, then you're going to create something else. And so we decided to create something else. And so yeah, I've been doing collective care since then for all of my care needs, and that's been a really huge part about how I think of organizing social justice and like queer liberation movements. I mean, it's about, and mostly queer community that is like supporting me in a very like daily way, and that I'm also supporting, right? Like not only is it like, a moment of like mutual aid and like shared like vulnerability and experiences, and we like build relationships because we see each other, once a week and we talk about things, but it also is like a way that a lot of people learn about like disability justice that they wouldn't have otherwise, and like a very like hands-on kind of way. So, yeah. I just went on a ramble there, but.
That was actually really good, very good information.
It was very, very good. But also going to comment that when I hear that, you made a really, really good point when you were stating earlier that with your very good friend, your best friend at the time, and how you'd sit around and talk, and how from that talking, from communication, and just talking about various important ideas that reflect you and your friends, and those friends would get together and you'd all sit around and talk, and from that talk, you produced a movement, which is very, very important to have, and you came together as a collective team, it sounds like, and through that helped each other and empowered each other with what idealism works for each other and as a group, in order to form a group and a collective, and what you believe in and how you work as an individual.
Yeah, and like, as like a community, like in, Richmond, like we're living in the like South, it's like the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War, so, being queer there was very different than being queer here in Toronto is for me in a lot of ways. And we also had like a lot of privilege too, right? Like we were all like mostly white queers, although there was, not all of us were white, but, we're still, like segregation is still quite rampant, and, but like, it just, because I was like such a core part of that community that it meant that the ways that we did organizing always took, into consideration, like access and like disability justice at the same time that it was thinking about queerness. And obviously those two things are not like, here's queer justice and here's disability justice, right? Those things are fundamentally like immersed, right? Intertwined, and like, especially for me, but, yeah, just seeing who we care about, who we organize with, and how that really, really changes what our organizing looks like, and what kinds of, what justice looks like, it makes such a huge difference, which is why it's like really important, I think, to like try to like fight against those like normative forces that are sort of trying to keep us separate from each other, right? Which is also part of why collective care is also like a really awesome thing too, because it's about coming together, right, and like creating a space together, and yeah, so I think and I think that like I've learned a lot about, how I sort of live in the world through care relationships that have, like, I've been very privileged because a lot of folks who rely on personal care have like a really hard time finding access to like respectful, like, mutually supportive care situations, right? So, I have that, and I feel like the fact that that's been the primary experience of care for me for the past 15 years has really changed about how I think about like how bodies should, can be together, and how people can relate to each other, and yeah, one of the most significant shifts for me was, even just like unlearning some of the ways that we think about like a care shift situation. So it's always just assumed that I'm the most vulnerable body in the situation because I'm the one that like has the need that's like getting met, right? But it's just, if you pause for a moment and really reflect on what's happening in those care shifts and in those moments, both bodies are coming together, both having needs, both having limitations, both having so we just come together and we have a conversation about like, what does your body do? What does my body do? What do our bodies need and want? And how can we make our bodies work together to like accomplish this thing that we want to do? And I feel like that has shifted so much of how I think about so much in my life. But Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Mhm. And also just thinking about like, like some of my, uh, there's also this assumption around vulnerability. There's also an assumption about like whose body is sort of out in that moment and whose body is on display in that moment. And for me, it was really powerful to realize how we both are sort of we're both very out about being bodies in that moment, right? Like, so like the care shifter shows up and they're like, oh, I biked up that hill to get to your house and so now I'm all sweaty. Sorry if I, smell bad. Or they're like, like it's like their body is just as much a part of the shift as mine is. And I think that a lot of times we forget how much vulnerability and how much, like how that's a space of shared vulnerability, or it can be, right? Because a lot of times what happens in those moments of vulnerability is that people want to like use power to like cover over their vulnerability rather than being like, okay, so we both have this, so how can we create something different in that moment? But,
So, as far as definitions go, how would you define queer liberation?
Yeah, that question, I was like, how would I define queer liberation?
And this is not something that don't try and think of textbook.
Yeah.
This is how you,
Yeah.
we don't want you to,
Well,
there's
Foucault says, yeah.
there's no right or wrong here. This is, because that's what happens,
Yeah.
you get all these scholars saying, well, this is what it is. But the reality is what people make it. So how...
Like expressed in your activism and art and your theory.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good reminder. I feel like for me, queer liberation, and I mean, it's fundamentally connected to, oh, I'm going to pause for a moment because somebody's coming in and I just want to not get distracted.
Okay.
Is this Casey Stephanie? Hey, Casey Stephanie.
Well, sir, you're in the middle of something, right?
Yeah, totally. But is there something you wanted or needed, or were you just popping by?
Oh, I just wanted to turn on this phone number, please.
Oh, okay. Can I call you with it later today?
No, it's fine.
Okay, awesome. I'll do that.
So again, how would you define queer liberation expressed through your activism, art, and theory?
Like liberate. For me, it's just about, I mean, like if I think about like what liberation would look like for me, it's obviously connected to like liberation for everyone but it also is, it would look like getting rid of cultures of undesirability. It would look like, people loving themselves and each other, and like not just for the parts that fit into like whatever boxes of privilege. And it would look like our world would be structured fundamentally different. Like there's just so many countless ways that right now, like who we are and how we like build lives with each other and love each other is so constrained by so many different aspects. And like even just like if you want to like live in a house with more than just like your monogamous partner and your 2.5 kids and a dog, it's like almost impossible to find like a house that would like rent to 4 or 5 or 6 like people who want to just live together and create family together in different ways. So and then when you try to find an accessible house on top of that, it's like actually impossible. So like I've lived in this house for 9 years because we can't find a house that would allow me to live with more than one person that would be accessible and affordable and all those other things. So it's part of what liberation looks like for me is that we have more of a opening of like the ways that we can like be with each other and love each other and yeah, care for each other and fuck and all those things. So I think that's what liberation for me looks like. And everybody has what they need, and there's not shame or stigma around having needs and or wants, and that those wouldn't even be like set up as these opposing categories, right? The whole like tension between a need and a want, right? But no, I think that's for me what liberation looks like, feels like.
That's wonderful.
What can queer I can't pronounce that word.
Liberation.
Yes,
How
liberation
liberation
is
is
learned by looking at our past.
Well, I think that one of the things that I take from looking at like past struggles is a lot of resilience, and just sort of like remembering that most of the things that we're struggling with right now are not like brand new inventions, and that people have been struggling and organizing forever, and that and so part of what we can take from that is just like different like models for, like, what I'm trying to say is like resilience. So one thing that I take from like looking back is like sort of like connecting with whether it's queer or crip or queer crip movements, is just these little moments of resistance that can keep motivating you to keep struggling, and also like seeing the ways that things have changed. Some, and obviously change is like a complicated, problematic thing, because sometimes it's like it's never just like this linear thing that's like always just getting a little bit better, right? And it's I think that is important. So
Can you see how it's affected our world from other movements?
Well, that's what I was just gonna say. I was like, part of what we get from looking at our history is also like recognizing the moments where we've sort of like sold out certain communities of people throughout history to gain progress, right? So like who we've sort of put on like whose backs we've sort of built the progress that we've gotten for like the more privileged people within the queer community. And so I think that like if we look back at like some of the most powerful moments for me around like queer liberation history is like things like Stonewall or the Compton riots, right? And how, this idea of like that you have to like not be angry, and that you have to like like incremental change and all of these sorts of things, but like those were moments where they were led by people of color, they were led by trans women, they were led by like sex workers, they were led by like folks who now in some queer communities are sort of like always the people that are sort of sold out as we try to like climb up the ladder of like progress and like privilege, right? So I think that is something that's really important to take from history, is just like remembering that like our like ancestors are people who have like not to sell each other out for a change that actually doesn't benefit us that much, right? Like, and that it's the whole like none of us are free until all of us are free, right? Or that's also like a lot of transformative justice work, which is from like communities of color, queer communities of color, is about trying to look at the folks who are most marginalized, and who centering them and their experiences, because of like the whole idea of like, I think Dean Spade calls it like the trickle up theory, right? Like, so rather than working on a trickle down method. Like, okay, so we'll get, you know, change and rights and liberation from for these like people like so now like rich white gay men can get married and have citizenship and all that sort of stuff, but it's not going to trickle down to like other folks, right? So I do think that that is something that's really important to remember from our history, and that to be critical when we're looking at the history, because a lot of the histories that are told leave out really important facts about like who was involved and why things happened, and to make it more palatable or make it fit more into like the dominant imaginings, which is part of why it's so important to have like connection with like folks who are telling stories and have experiences that are outside of like the dominant sort of imaginings, because it's how we open it up more to allow for more more vivid and imaginings, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I think Potter mentioned this too. What are the most pivotal moments in our histories, and what we can learn from them? And how does queer liberation differ from gay, lesbian liberation, and queer nation?
Yeah, I think for me, like, and I always feel like it's a little bit problematic, but I definitely have the sort of like standard, like how is queer different than like gay liberation? For me, queer is, you know, much more fluid. It's like committed to like radical politics, and it in my world has a much more broad understanding of what queer is and means, and what queer experiences are, and what queer desires are, and what queer pleasures are, and queer bodies are and can be. But I do sort of think that it's a bit problematic when queers sort of like define themselves in opposition to like all other categories of people as being not as like rad as they are or whatever, not as like fluid and gender non-conforming and all these other things, right? Like I think that it makes so much more sense for us to like, rather than defining ourselves based in opposition to and like kind of moral superiority over other liberation struggles, to see like the points where we can connect and like the points where we can like move together. And yeah.
That's great. That's a very good perspective.
What does queer liberation have to say about progress, time, and modernity?
Modernity, yeah, I remember that
Yes.
question. For me, like, and I would say this is more about like a queer crip liberation. When I think about like what that has to say about time, progress, and modernity, I think that you know, one of the things that we learn is that time and pace look different and feel different for everyone, and that, you know, like there's like the idea of like we just have to, because there's such huge amounts of like violence and like oppression that people are dealing with, and like people are like dying every day because of like marginality and oppression and the ways that that's playing out, and you know, people are like locked away in prisons and in like nursing homes, and which are also prisons in effect, and I think that like, so there's like that urgency, like, and I feel that urgency in a really sincere way, but I feel like the important thing is to like also like honor that like sometimes we have to move slower so that we can all move together, and like not sort of centering certain styles of movement over others. And I think that it's important to sort of figure out ways to be resilient and survive in everyday moments and in the like very in the face of lots of oppression, because I also don't think that like change is going to happen like quickly, you know, like the joke of like, oh, the revolution still hasn't happened yet, you know, like, but after the revolution, la la la, you know, like it's not going to be like that, we all know that, but which I think is why it's a funny joke that everybody's like, after the revolution, I won't have to worry about this anymore, or whatever, you know. I think that is ridiculous, and I actually don't think that like also my idea of like liberation doesn't include like ever not worrying about whether everybody's getting what they need and and living their lives in ways that feel good for them, right? Like that doesn't seem like a liberation to me. Yeah, I think that it's about that tension between dealing with the urgency and the crisis that so many of us are facing, and also remembering to like that slowness is actually important too, and that like taking our time to make sure that everybody is able to participate in a way that works for them, and like figuring out new ways of organizing that allow for that. You know, like there's like the classic like, and I've been this person many times in my life. The classic like you're part of some social justice organization, and then there's like the two of you that are like the like the leaders in your non-hierarchical collective organization, and you do all the work and you like do everything, and like then you burn out after like a few years, and then the organization just sort of dies, right? Or like another two people will rise up and then become those people, and then they'll burn out and then they go on. Whereas if we can just figure out a way to like break out of that mold, I think that that would be really a good strategy, and I think it means doing things very, very differently than we do them now. And I mean, it's tricky too because it's always in the context of like capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy, and so then those dynamics are always operating in how and what we can do, right? So.
That's very good.
So for sorry, I haven't done this before.
Yeah, totally. I'm fine. Take your time.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things she's touched on already. I guess one of the questions was, how has queer liberation been different from gay liberation going forward? I know you've touched on some of those things. And I mean, if you want to talk about that as well as incorporate it into this question about pride celebrations, the LGBTQ culture, postmodernist nations of sexuality, gender identity, and identity politics. So that's sort of a little bit if you want to talk about that. And how I mean, you've already touched on gay marriage as well, but how all those things come to play and how they have differed from, you know, our movement in the past.
Yeah. So.
And going forward.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I think that it's about, for me, the biggest difference in you know the ways that I sort of frame gay liberation struggles and like aims, and queer liberation struggles and aims is the difference between like, you know, like we want in, right, and we want something different, you know, and we want something new or else, you know. And so I think, you know, like gay liberation, I feel like is very much about like not sort of challenging the existing structural organization too much, right? Like it's like a little bit like, so, you know, open the door so that like more people can come in, but still keeping out lots and lots of folks who would bring with them things that would fundamentally challenge the organizing of those social structures. So it's like as long as we can keep the box the same, we'll make it a little bit bigger, but we're not going to like fundamentally change it. And I think that that means that the folks who, like, life just gets better for folks who are really, really privileged or privileged in particular ways, along the lines of like class and gender and race and ability and all that sort of thing. So I think that that for me is one of the biggest differences between like gay liberation and queer liberation. And obviously gay liberation does shake up things a little bit, right? But for me, it's just never been enough, and it just, you know, it's sort of that like that it involves like leaving parts of you behind, which is an impossible thing for people to do. And also, you know, just like my lived experiences of like, you know, thinking about like pride movements, and both in Richmond, Virginia, and here in Toronto. And, you know, in Richmond, like, the gay movement really didn't like us in a lot of ways, like, as, like, the, like, 10 radical queers that lived in Richmond when I lived there. And so we were, like, this small but very, like, vocal and mighty group. But, we, yeah, like, you know, we, like, me and my friend were, like, going home from a bar one night, and, like, a truck drove by us, and this, like, lesbian yelled out the window at us and was like, "The Lesbian Avengers suck," because we were part of the Lesbian Avengers when I lived in Richmond, and we were just like, we just got like, you know, gay bashed verbally by a lesbian. Like, you know, it's bad when like the gay community is being homophobic towards you, right? Like, we were just like, what just happened there? Trying to make sense of it, right? And it was mostly they just didn't like the fact that we were like really political and like really about like, no, this, like, we need to change things pretty drastically. So that's like, yeah. So, and like pride was always, you know, like I remember there was one year in Richmond Pride, the year after September 11th, where they decided to make Pride a fundraiser for the Red Cross, and we were just like, that doesn't make any sense. The Red Cross doesn't, like, it's completely homophobic and like discriminates against sex workers and drug users and gay men and like all kinds of things, and we were just like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so we like had like a protest of that aspect of it, and people hated us for it. They thought we were like the big, you know, we didn't like pride or something, and we're like, we like being proud of who we are. We just don't like supporting really homophobic and nationalist projects. And so, you know, we joked that year about like making up T-shirts that said that we were like one of those people at Pride, you know, because there's always that idea of like the gays that like make everybody look good, and then the gays that make everybody look bad or whatever. And so we were like definitively one of those people at Pride, and proud of that. And you know, I think that it's partly the ways that like Pride and like so much social justice stuff gets co-opted by like sort of mainstream dominant cultures as a way to like sort of diffuse it or take away some of the power or the threat of what it is doing. So I think that like, yeah, that's part of why Pride is not actually a proud event for a lot of us. And I mean, I think that's part of why I start talking more about like resilience and hope and those kinds of things, because of like trying to find new ways of talking about pride. I also don't think that shame I think shame is a really interesting phenomenon, but it's like, you know, the idea of like overcoming shame. I mean, I'm critical of overcoming narratives in a variety of ways, but I'm also critical of like the idea of like overcoming shame, because I feel like shame is actually like can be a really useful thing because of the ways that like shame is sort of deployed to sort of I mean, if you think about the places where we feel shame in our lives, our experiences, our desires, our bodies, all of these things, it's usually the things that offer up like a threat or a challenge to sort of normative ways of being. So we feel a lot of shame for those things as a way to keep us disconnected from them and to keep us from accessing those very parts about ourselves that are like have a lot of potential and resources for like imagining the world in a different way. And so I'm like, I think that feeling of shame can be actually really useful. Like, okay, so why am I feeling that? Where am I feeling that? What is underneath of that? And like, what is sort of being, what am I sort of being encouraged to not access? And then going there, you know, and accessing that part. So, yeah.
So in a way, you're saying that that's what queer liberation is all about, is
Mm-hmm.
embracing all that.
Yeah, like accessing those very things about us that like pose differences and give us a new way of, or different ways of imagining. Because, you know, like I said, people have been doing this stuff for.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And that's one of the things that going forward that many of us in the queer community feel.
Mm-hmm.
We all feel that, you know, we don't want to be typecast as a single entity and split up, like you say,
Mm-hmm.
so that we're sort of put away and not looked at. We want to be our own selves, all together in unison,
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so, exactly, we want to be recognized. We don't want to we don't want to fit in their box.
Yeah.
We want to say that we're part of a bigger box,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't. It's not, you know, that, and that's what I think the difference for me and for many in the queer community is that you know, that's the big difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
They
is
were
the
like,
big
get rid of the box and make something new.
Well, yes.
Or make something different. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I also think that like, right, like moving, like one of the things that applies, like just like, yeah, like connecting to, oh, I don't know how I want to say that yet. I think I might need more time to think that one through. But yeah, just thinking about moving forward, whatever that looks like. Moving sideways, moving around. I think, yeah, it's, you know, and I often worry sometimes that, like, the work that I do, because, I mean, I haven't really talked very much about it, but I make porn, and I make porn for a reason, and part of that is because of, I started doing, you know, similar to this idea of, like, sites of shame as sites of resistance. Like, I started sort of, like, you know, as part of this, like, queer community, this rad queer community. You know, in Richmond, I was pretty much the only person with a visible disability in my community, and the only disabled person. And for so long, I was like, oh God, I'm the only radical queer disabled person in the whole world. There's no one else. And then luckily, I discovered Eli Clare and also AJ Withers. I met them both at the True Spirit conference, and I was like, okay, I'm not the only one. Great. And you know, and so I started connecting with other like rad queer crip community, and that like really fundamentally changed a lot for me. But I still sort of felt that like within like the queer, larger queer community, that like there was never any sort of well, actually, like outside of like queer communities, just like in the world at large, I felt like there was never anything that sort of like gave me feelings of like hope and possibility around like my own desirability as like a person in the world. So, you know, there's lots of like ideas and representations of like disability that are like the tragic, sad, disabled person who never gets dates. You know, there's lots of stuff that reinforce those sort of dominant narratives of like either undesirability or hyper sexualizing and hyper desirability. But there wasn't anything that I saw out there that was sort of about creating something that spoke to desirability, love, like lovability, and hot, like the ways that like queer crip sex and desires and pleasures and experiences are amazing and hot and fabulous, and everybody could benefit from and enjoy and should be reveling in queer crip imaginings. And so I was like, well, I guess since it doesn't exist, I just have to make it. And so I did. And so then I started making porn. And that really for me was like about seeing myself as desirable, seeing myself as hot and sexy, but not in ways that fit into sort of like, you know, the like standard ideas of like what, like I had seen some porn, some queer porn, enough to see that I wasn't represented out there anywhere. But I just sort of made a video that I thought was hot and put that out into the world, and it was very well received because people were like, yes, this isn't out there, and this is like speaks to something that I've been wanting, right? So that was part of why I started making porn, was so that I could like not only see my own desirability in myself, but also like sharing it with other queer crips, and also like opening up like in other like non-disabled queers' minds, like who is desirable, because there's this whole like economy of desirability within the queer scene that then replicates so much of like normative culture, right? So like who's like seen as like a hot person in the queer scene is, you know, very in line with like normative culture, I feel like. I'm like, you know, I often like think about or joke, I'm like nobody's type. Like, you're never just like sitting around at like a party or something and people are like, oh, you know, my type, oh, it's, you know, I like to date queer femmes who use wheelchairs. You know, like you just don't hear that, right? But what you do hear is like, oh, I mostly date trans guys. Or, you know, so part of what I'm trying to do is like open up sort of like people's own, like who they desire, why they desire, and get them to start thinking about those things. And also, I started making porn because I was doing lots of workshops and talking about it in like classrooms and in activist circles and all kinds of things around like disability and sexuality and queerness. And I just felt like people were like, yes, disabled people are sexual, check, I get it, okay, good. But nobody was really going to that place of like, oh yeah, hot, I get it, totally, feel it, I'm into it, you know, in like a like complex kind of way, not just in like a fetishistic kind of way. So that's also why I started making porn. And I feel like a lot of that is about like sort of reclaiming stuff that I do, but not just about like reclaiming something that was lost or that was like unearthing this thing that was like covered over, but like about making something new too, right? So it's not just about like a reclaiming of something in the past or something that I was left out of, but like about creating something new, because I feel like those two things are really important. Like I think it's really important to create something different rather than just like reclaiming a sort of imagined past thing.
And plus you mentioned too before that, I mean, it's always been there, but no one's talked about it. It's never been sort of out there. And so you're putting it forward in a way, and that's what you...
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's also too, like, when I think about, like, the importance of queer history, too, it's like, for me, like, it's it's also about the importance of, like, I mean, some of the most powerful, life-changing, inspiring in a good way, not in a, you know, charity model kind of way, but like moments that I've had, conversations I've had, shared experiences that I've had have been with like trans women that I've had like conversations around sexual marginalization with, just being like, you get it, and like, you know, like a lot of like the Black feminism that I've been reading throughout my life has also been like these moments where I'm like, yes, there's something really powerful around like visibility and around sexual marginalization and around privilege and around oppression that's happening, and like those have been like sites in my life and people in my life that have totally shifted and transformed the ways I make sense of the work that I'm doing, and I think it's really important to honor those moments. I think that's also important about like the past is also like acknowledging sort of like who brought us here and how and why and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That's really wonderful.
I did see a movie, by the way.
Oh, good.
It was absolutely fascinating.
Nice. Yay.
So amazing. She's touched on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think we've got a lot of material here, and
Mhm.
sort of what we do to wrap up, and you've touched upon everything
Yes.
in many ways.
Although I realized I was like, I haven't talked enough about being femme. That's really important.
Okay, so that's sort of the last thing. I want you to sort of talk about something that you feel you haven't,
Mm-hmm.
or if you want to share as well.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead, and this will sort of, if I mean, you know, femme in your how you interpret it
Yeah.
within our community,
Mm-hmm.
within the queer community, what that
Mhm.
means. So
Mhm.
go ahead, whatever.
Yeah, I'm like, where to start? I mean, part of like how my femme identity also contributes to how I envision liberation is that it will be like sparkly. And it will be, you know, like there's all those sort of like feminist utopias where they imagine that everybody wears like tunics or something, and I'm just like, my future utopia does not involve tunics. I mean, people can wear tunics if they want to, but my future involves lots of glitter, lots of like things that make you feel fabulous, and I think that that's like really, really important. And I mean, I don't just think that like femmes contribute that to the queer community. Like, I think that there's lots of different ways to feel fabulous, but I do think that like that's one thing that femmes do really well and like create space for by doing that is about like connecting with like things that make you feel pleasure and make you feel fabulous and make you feel good. And I think that, and about making each other feel those things too, right? Because, you know, it's like the femme greeting is always the like, oh, I like this, oh, I like that too, you know, like compliments, right? Like, and I think that that's about like collective, like, because it's not just about like building up like self-love or self-worth, but about like collective love for each of us and all of us. And so I think that's one thing that like feminist has contributed to my vision of liberation, is that it will be like sparkly and full of beautiful colors, and it will feel really good, and just like like a lot of my work is sort of around like, you know, like revaluing kinds of labor that happen, right? Like, so relationship building is like key to movement building, and that's also like a traditionally like identified as like a feminine skill, right? And I do think that like that is like sort of revaluing those kinds of things and like bringing them into the movement. I think it's really, really important. And well, the movement or movements, but So I think that that's also really important. Yeah, I think I mean, there's probably infinite more things that I could say about feminists.
I like the idea when you were saying about glittery, and then I look at your earrings, and all the old saying, you wear your heart on your sleeve.
Yeah, right?
You wear it in your ears.
Yeah, right? I wear it
Visible
lots of places.
display.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that,
Well, Loree, I think your beauty and your attitude is beautiful, and all those things combined as part of the feminist that you feel, and your persona portrays that.
thank you.
Yes.
Awesome.
Definitely, and that's very nice. It's very true to have that sort of spirit
Yeah.
to move and to progress forward and to make the movement feel that way as well. The things you do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's part of like, yeah, like my experience is like when I lived in Richmond, I was not only the only, like visibly disabled person or disabled like person who had a disability identity in my community of queers, but I was also like the only femme-identified person for like a really, really long time, and you know, it's just like yeah, like part of that. Like connecting with that was also about expanding what queer is, right? Like so the idea that, you know, I think there was like a question around like, is visibility an important aspect to like the queer liberation movement? And I'm like, that's really complicated because like you can be visible in a particular way, but it's always about the ways that what that sort of visibility, how that visibility is being read, right? So it's like, I think I'm incredibly visible as like a queer person in the world and as a queer femme in the world, and but yet so often people don't read that at all, right? And I also am like really visible as like a disabled person in the world, but what people see when they see my disability isn't how I understand my disability or how I make sense of what disability means in the world. You know, for me, disability is an awesome, good thing in the world and like provides some really important like challenges for reorganizing how we are together and how we do things in the world. So, yeah, I think that those are all like visibility is like incredibly complex. But yeah. That's my friends always tease me. They're like, you know, he can always tell, like, you just end everything with, like, well, it's complicated, because it is. Everything complex.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful interview.
Cool,
It's-
thank
you
you.
said some amazing things, and this is perfect.
Sweet. Great,
Yeah.
good. Well, if there's things that I have forgotten or whatever, I guess I'll be in touch, but...
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Now, the other question I had for you was not so much a comment, but you make films and you make some. Can I use some of the material for background usage throughout?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because there would be credit in that. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I have a copy of my film as behind the light there in that black crate, so we can totally use that. There's 2 different videos, so you can use from either of those. I also have one, but it's not quite ready for public consumption yet.
Okay.
Making a princess porn.
Wow, that sounds really
Yeah,
neat.
which is fun. It's princess. It's around femme identity.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic.
Cool.
All right. Well, that would be great.
Sweet.
So, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you guys for your...
Oh, thank you. It's a
Questions
great
and-
privilege for me. I'm helping out Davina, and this is my first time. So,
Oh, great.
so.
So, have you met AJ before, the girl who was?
No, I haven't. Mm-mm.